Hello. Bit of a weird video. Bit of an out of the blue rant here, but I was lying awake last night thinking about something that still pissed me off from my career playing poker over 10 years ago. And it's a very simple thing, and it's also a very compelling thing, I think, and it's something that I've just never really heard anybody else talk about ever. So I wanted to record a little video to motivate it for you and give you something to think about, and maybe you'll think it's interesting too. So poker is a card game. You sit at a table. Let's say that there are 6 people at this table. I don't know, it doesn't really matter that much, because I'm going to have 4 of them fold straight away. So this player folds, this player folds, this player folds, this player folds, and you have 2 players left. Now, in poker, this player is called the button, and the player with the button acts last all of the time after the first round of betting. So they have the largest advantage in the hand, but they're gone already, and we're into the small blind and the big blind. These players have already committed some number of chips, half a big blind and a full big blind, into the middle of the pot, and they still have their cards. We're playing Texas No Limit Hold'em here, but I think this example can work in a lot of other games. And they have a pot to play now, basically. And if you're playing a game of poker and all you're doing is playing for cash, you just play poker here. The big blind is going to have what's called position against the small blind in every, well, at every moment of the hand, and that means that the small blind is going to be forced to act first. So the big blind will get to see what happens and react, and that gives the big blind a general advantage. Also, the big blind has already put in 1 full big blind, and the small blind has only put in half a big blind. So when you play this situation in a game of cash poker, the tendency is for the big blind to win most of the time. That doesn't mean that the small blind can't have a strong hand and make money sometimes, but this is sort of a no-win spot where the big blind is advantaged, and the small blind doesn't really have anything going for them at all. It's one of the simplest spots in No Limit Hold'em. Every advantage is for the big blind, basically. The only way that the small blind is going to have a winning strategy is if they get dealt very strong cards, or if the big blind is playing very poorly, which we're mostly going to discount the idea that the players might be playing wrong at the moment, because it's just too complicated to consider it. All right, so that's all fairly straightforward for a cash game. You just play poker. But what happens in a tournament game? Well, in a tournament game, let's say that the prize pool is... Let's say that there are 6 players left in the tournament, and it's just going to be $6 for first place, 5 for second, 4 for third, 3 for fourth, 2 for fifth, and 1 for last. And so if you imagine that all of these players have the same amount of chips left in the tournament, just to simplify it, the average amount that someone's expecting to make right now is about $350. And that's the expectation of everybody sitting at this table before this hand started, if you ignore the fact that they have different relative positions to the button at the moment, which is a small but true consideration. The thing is that, say the small blind and the big blind really go to war in this hand, and one of them knocks the other out. The consequence of that isn't that the person who knocked the other out doubles how much they're expecting to win in the tournament, even though they doubled the amount of chips they had by taking all of their opponent's chips. So what happens if the big blind gets knocked out is that their expectation goes from 350 to 0. Now they're expecting 0. Well, okay, actually 1, because they get last place. So they get $1. And when the small blind knocks them out and doubles their chips, they can't double their expectation, because to double your expectation would mean that now you're expecting to win $7, but first place in the tournament only awards $6. So you can't possibly have that happen. The highest your expectation could possibly be here would be $6, and that would be if you won the tournament 100% of the time from the situation you were in. And doubling your chips, like, there are still 4 other players in the tournament. You're going to win more than them since you have double their chips, but you're not going to win every single time. So obviously, this small blind is not having $6 worth of expectation. And exactly how much expectation the small blind does truly have is very complicated to work out. But because of the fact that they're playing in a tournament instead of a cash game, the chips aren't all worth the same amount of money, is the central drive. And the analysis of this, let's say that they're now expecting like 450 or something. I don't know. I'm just going to give a random number. The analysis of this is called ICM, which stands for Independent Chip Modeling. And the point is that every chip actually has a different amount of value. And because of that, the ways that you have to play to win chips or risk your own chips in a tournament poker setting is different from a cash game setting. You have to be very careful about losing your last chips. You have to consider that winning more chips may not be very valuable right now compared to making sure that you don't get knocked out of the tournament before somebody else. Very demonstrative situation where you'd consider ICM would be if there were 3 players left and one of them only had 1 big blind left, and the other player in the tournament just tried to force you all in and risk your entire tournament life. The player with 1 chip left is almost certainly going to get knocked out very soon, and so it doesn't make sense for you to risk your entire tournament life and risk getting knocked out in the third yourself when you could just fold in that situation. So ICM is this very powerful, complicated, and weird way of analyzing the value of chips in a tournament. And it's very hard to clearly work out exactly what its implications are everywhere. There are all sorts of weird second-order effects and things like that, which make it hard to analyze. But in this very simplified situation, the point that I want to make about ICM, and the point that any tournament regular will understand about ICM from this situation, is that now all of a sudden, because of ICM, let's say that these players don't have a ton of money. The small blind actually does have an advantage. In a cash game, the small blind had basically no advantage in the situation, but because of ICM, if the small blind puts tons of chips in the middle, let's say they bet 10 big blinds or something, it's very hard for the big blind to keep playing the hand because they're being confronted with this situation where the small blind is asking them to risk lots of chips. And if they agree to engage in that situation, well, we saw that at the start of this hand, the big blind and the small blind summed together at $7 expectation, 350 plus 350. But after they go to war with each other here, there's no way that they can still have $7 expectation. By going to war with each other in this spot, they're both lowering their expected value in the rest of the tournament. And the small blind has sort of forced the issue, and now the big blind's having to respond by folding. And this tilts the way that these situations are favored in some situations. It depends exactly on how much money the 2 players have and what stuff is going on elsewhere in the tournament. But because it's no longer all in the favor of the big blind, every factor, because it's no longer just that the big blind has position and has the most chips in the pot already and stuff like that, which is allowing the big blind to win in this situation most of the time. Now the small blind actually can have an advantage when you consider stack sizes and independent chip modeling, which might allow the small blind to win the pot most of the time in some circumstances. And that's a pretty big deal, and it's a pretty weird deal. But there's a third thing that's going on here, and it has just bugged the shit out of me that I've never heard anybody talk about it, ever. And anytime that I try to bring it up when I'm talking about tournament poker, people start talking about ICM and sort of just ignore what I'm saying. And that's that in this situation, the 2 players can be in a prisoner's dilemma. So, what's a prisoner's dilemma? Let's say, I'm actually going to explain a tragedy of the commons, which is basically a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma because I think it's more intuitive. Let's say that you go to the park and there's trash on the ground. So if you just casually pick the trash up and put it in the trash can, the park is pretty. And it's more pleasant for yourself and for everybody there. And so you have this behavior that's pretty easy for you. It just doesn't take that much work. And it makes the experience pleasant for everybody. Now, the tragedy of the commons, and the commons refers to a park. That's like an old-fashioned word for a public park. An old-fashioned word for a public park, basically, is that suppose that you don't pick up that trash. Well, now you can just rely on somebody else to do it, because they're still in a situation where they have this relatively easy thing to do, which will make the park prettier, and everybody benefits. But then suppose that they don't do it. Well, somebody else will pick up the slack. And you reach a point in the tragedy of the commons where it's possible for people to freeload and not do their share and just benefit from other people doing the work, and it's possible for so many people to continuously freeload that the entire system breaks down. And all of a sudden, nobody's picking up trash. And all of a sudden, when you go to the park, there's trash everywhere. And it's not pleasant to go to the park. And it's not easy for you to fix it anymore because there's so much of it, because nobody's doing their share. So the tragedy of the commons describes the situation where it is possible for everyone to reach the best outcome by cooperating together. But it's not actually in anybody's individual best interest at any time to cooperate. If you analyze solely from a selfish perspective, it's in your best interest to not pick up that trash when you see it, because somebody else will do it for you. And then 5 years down the road, when you go to the park and it's just covered in trash, it's in your interest to just leave and not do all of the work to fix it, because you wouldn't get enough benefit out of doing all of that work to fix it, since it was being shared amongst everybody else. So this situation is a lot like that. If the small blind and the big blind go to war here, their overall expectation in the tournament goes down. The expectation shared between the two of them goes down. And it may be the case that small blind's cards are really good, or big blind's cards are really good. And so independently, they should go to war because they got dealt really good cards right now, and their personal expectation in the tournament will go up, even though the sum expectation of the two parties will go down from its starting value of 7. That's possible. But it's also possible that neither of them get particularly good cards, and either of them trying to press their personal advantages in this pot, whether it's the ability to get lots of money in first, or the ability to play with position and see what your opponent does before you have to act on every street. Those are the advantages the small blind and big blind have respectively. Either of them may actually find that by doing that, they're not allowing the two of them together to reach the best outcome. There are going to be situations where, because of stack sizes and ICM consideration and the cards that both of them are dealt, the correct outcome is for them to resolve this pot as peacefully as possible. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. Like, maybe it looks like small blind just calling here. So small blind upgrades from 0.5 to 1 big blind in the middle, and then they just check down and see how the cards are out and who wins. And to somebody who's all about winning at poker, I think that idea sounds ludicrous. It sounds like not playing correctly. It sounds like collusion. Quite frankly, collusion is when players basically cooperate with each other to help the other one make money. And at a poker table, the rules are such that you're only meant to act in your own best interest, otherwise it's cheating. But this isn't actually collusion if you're in a prisoner's dilemma, because your best interest is to reach a state where you're cooperating with the other player. That is actually what you want to happen at the end. And you can treat this as an iterative prisoner's dilemma. And in an iterative prisoner's dilemma, the general winning strategy based on experimentation and study and whatever is called tit for tat. How tit for tat works is that you start off cooperating, and then if you ever see somebody else stop cooperating, you stop cooperating with them. It's a very simple strategy. It's studied and seen in international politics and things like this. And so perhaps the way that you should be playing this is, as the small blind, you just call and give big blind a chance to cooperate with you. And then you can't really get upset if big blind doesn't cooperate with you because they have pocket aces. They have a strong hand in that situation. You're not actually in a situation where the prisoner's dilemma applies, because they're sitting there in a spot where they expect to win money, which means it's somewhat difficult to tell if they're defecting and not cooperating with you. But there's probably, I feel, some way to play poker as a whole over a long-term career where you do implement a style of play which tries to cooperate in these situations. There's even really interesting stuff going on with the concept of an enforcer here. So an enforcer in a prisoner's dilemma or a tragedy of the commons is someone who punishes people for not cooperating. This is one of the ways that we see societies successfully cooperate in tragedies of the common. If you look at bats, some colonies of bats, the mothers share the burden of feeding each other's young. And some of the mothers won't help. And there are bats which go around and punish those mothers for not helping. So, like, bats have worked this out. You would think that humans would be able to work this out too. So there's an interesting situation here where a big blind can actually choose to be an enforcer, even. Let's say small blind goes in for $10, 10 big blinds or whatever. Big blind's in this situation where they know that they're going to lose value overall by calling a lot of the time. They only get to call with particularly strong cards because of the ICM considerations which are going on. But big blind can choose to be an enforcer. Big blind can say, hey, you're shoving all in way too often, and you're trying to cheat in this scenario where we should be cooperating, so I'm just going to call you. And what happens here, and what happens generally to enforcers, is that they're doing extra work, and it's not great for them, but they cause society to move toward an equilibrium of cooperation. All of a sudden, when you're sitting there in the small blind and you're thinking about shoving all your money in, you have to think, wait a second, I don't know for sure that I'm actually going to get this person to fold a lot and benefit from independent chip modeling. They might choose to enforce, in which case both of us are getting punished when I choose to shove all in. And that's a real thing. And I've just never heard anybody suggest that you could do that in poker. And this distresses me extremely. I basically didn't play tournament poker in my poker career because I couldn't reconcile that this was going on. Poker players should be some of the most accomplished strategic minds in the world. Poker is a meritocracy which rewards strategic thinking, and people who play poker should, in my opinion, be able to consider game theory and the implications of what they're doing. And because of that, my expectation would be that poker players would see a situation that was like a prisoner's dilemma and be able to rationalize about what that meant. But when I see these players who play poker instead only considering short-term personal gain in a situation like this, and they're like the most competent game theory appliers, or whatever you want to say, of like any profession that I know. They win and lose money solely based on their ability to understand and apply game theory, basically. But they just like don't recognize that this is going on at all, as far as I can tell. And so when those people go to the park, are they going to pick up the trash? Are they going to get why that's a big deal? And if they aren't going to get why that's a big deal, is anybody else going to get why that's a big deal? And this distresses me. So, basically because of this, I never played tournament poker seriously. I stuck to cash game poker, and I ended up stopping playing cash game poker for other concerns. There are lots of reasons to not like poker as a profession, but it was like fun for a while and rewarding, and there are lots of reasons to like it as a profession too, so I'm not intending for this to all be negative. But yeah, the big thing I wanted to convey is just this relatively simple situation and how complex it actually is, and the fact that I never saw a single person interacting with that complexity in any way whatsoever. And it distressed me. And maybe by watching this video, I have made you start to think about this situation, and maybe you'll start interacting with it. Maybe you don't play poker, but maybe you'll see other parts of your life where you're like, oh, this is going on. Maybe I should be doing something. So, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed my rant.